guys digging the new feel of the series? Isn't that cool? Do you see the artwork coming through the front door? Our man, Don Barnett, has done all of this. And so, man, give Don a big hand. He is... worked hard on this, looking forward to the series. But before we get underway, before I pray, quick announcement. Last week, I came up here and said, man, everybody, we have this opportunity. There's the property next to the hub, and we'd love to buy it. And if it came together, that'd be cool. And guess what happened this week? We signed the contract. That's what happened this week. Not only that, let me add to it, and I'm going to pray and say, Jesus, you're awesome. Thank you. All right. So, but just given the number, so the elder said, hey, we have about $210,000 we could put toward that property. The asking price was just shy of $300,000, which meant there was a deficit. We thought, okay, we're probably going to have to borrow to do this. And in the first couple of days of the week, over $90,000 came in this week. You know, and so just covered that, like Jesus knew this is what you need. We never told you what the number was. It's just Jesus, that's what you need. I'll give it to you now. So just a huge blessing all the way around. And so going to be closing on that really quickly, just in a couple of weeks. And so very excited about that. And also it looks like we're really close to landing on an architect to start giving us some ideas of what can be. So all the way around, cool things are happening, starting a new series. And so let's go ahead and pray together, get ready for today. Jesus, I thank you so much for just your provision. I mean, I know myself. I'm the guy that guards himself. I'm the guy that says, God can do it, but, and then I come up with the reasons why it's easy for me to justify the sin of my doubt. And then every time you show up and you do something that just reminds me, hey, Matt, I got this. I'm in control. I do the heavy lifting. Stop worrying about that which is not yours to worry about. It just goes back to that passage in Philippians about be anxious for nothing, but with prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, make your requests known to God and do it in everything. And so, again, I just want to stop and thank you for what you've done for redemption, for the hub, for the property next door, for the generosity of our people, for the fact that this is a place where the people love your word. They want to know more of you. They want to be inundated and saturated by your life. And so I pray, even as we go into this new series, that that's exactly what would happen, that you would confront us, that you would move us, that you would inspire us, that you would change us and challenge us, so that we just want to know you more. And from that, you change our lives. The thing I know is that life with Jesus is better. And I pray that we would believe that in an everyday sort of way. So work and shape and move for your glory and for our good. We ask these things in your perfect name. Amen. So one of the things that I think we sometimes forget about Jesus is that Jesus grew up reading his Bible. He was a good Jewish boy, and he made sure to be a student of his Bible. Now, for Jesus, his Bible is what we call the Hebrew Testament or the Old Testament. So if you grab your Bible, it's that big front chunk of the Bible. That was Jesus's Bible. And Jesus was a student of the Bible. Jesus was one that would memorize passages of the Bible. He was really big into making sure he knew his Bible. And when you study the life of Jesus, when you go through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you read the red letters, you see that he quotes the Old Testament a lot. And when you watch him quoting, you see that there was one particular author or writer of the Old Testament that really comes to the surface. There was one particular person, of all the persons that God used to write the Old Testament, that Jesus really gravitated toward. And that person was a man by the name of Moses. Jesus quoted Moses more than anyone else. He referred to Moses and his stories and his teachings more than anyone else. And Moses was this interesting guy. So he starts off as a descendant of Abraham. He and his relatives are there then in the land of Egypt. This is after they go from the promised land, they call it, from their home or heritage down to Egypt. There's hundreds and hundreds of years of the Jews living there, the Israelites living there, until Moses' family comes along in the timeline of history. And they come at a really rotten time. It's a time in which the kings of Egypt, the Pharaoh, says the Israelites are becoming too strong, too powerful, too dangerous. They're all slaves, but they're slaves that are poised for revolt. And so the Pharaoh decides to kill all the male Israelites that are being born, just throw them in the water or kill them in some way, to eradicate or thin out the risk. And Moses is one of these people as a small child that's slated for this death, but he is saved, rescued, put in a basket, sent down the river. And the daughter of Pharaoh finds the small child in a basket and takes the child as her own. And so in this odd twist of events, a child that the Pharaoh wants to kill ends up becoming a child that grows up in the home of Pharaoh. I mean, it's just a strange twist of events. Certainly controlled by God, because God's got a plan. And so Moses grows up in the home of Pharaoh. He's basically Pharaoh's grandkid, right? And one day he's out and he sees that, he knows he's an Israelite. He knows that somehow. And he sees what's going on with his people. And he sees this Egyptian slave driver beating one of the Israelites. And so he takes it upon himself to kind of go into this vigilante mode. And he kills this slave driver beating this Israelite. And then he realizes after that, that's a bad idea. I probably shouldn't kill one of Grandpa's guys, right? You kill one of Grandpa's friends, Grandpa's not going to be pleased with you, right? So he decides to flee. He goes off into the desert, and he's there for a very long time until one day God meets up with Moses at the scene where this bush is burning, and God calls to Moses, and he says, I'm going to use you, I'm going to move you, I'm going to use you as an instrument to liberate my people. And so this process begins, this process that we call Exodus, where the Israelites are leaving Egypt and going back to their home. In other words, he's going to lead a group of refugees to the place that they originally hail from. And it's in the midst of all of that that then God begins to speak to Moses and begins to have Moses pen 5 different pieces of literature. And those 5 different pieces of literature become the center point of the belief system of the Israelites. And the very first one of those pieces of literature is called the Book of Genesis, or the Book of Origins. And that is the series we're starting today. We're going to spend the next 3 months or so just going through this very first book of the Bible, understanding the origins of how God introduced himself in a radical and powerful way to the human race and how that shaped even our lives today. And so, if you have a Bible or a Bible app, I want to invite you right now to open up to the very first book of the Bible. To say, just open to page 1. That makes it so easy, right? So, open to page 1. Open to this first piece of literature from Moses, given by God to Moses, the first book that Jesus would read when he was growing up, this book of Genesis. Now, today we are looking at God the Creative, God the Creator. We're looking at Genesis chapter 1 through the very beginning of Genesis chapter 2. Now, in doing this is going to be fantastic because what I know instantly is everybody in this room agrees on Genesis 1. Right? Everybody's going to see Genesis 1 the exact same. There's no conspiracy, there's no problem, there's no debate, there's no disagreement, is there, about Genesis chapter 1? Everybody on planet Earth looks at Genesis 1 and reads it the exact same way, right? So my job is easy, right? I figure by the end, if I've offended everybody in the room, I've unified you all right? So my mission today is to try to get us to do something a little different than the way I think sometimes this particular section of the Bible is faced. Because typically what happens when people begin to look at this book, we begin to look with very Western eyes. We look with Enlightenment eyes. We look with Newtonian eyes. Right? We look with eyes that have a mindset on relativity or geology or some other science. And then we try to figure out how Genesis 1 fits into the worldview that we've had handed to us, right? We're immersed in this context all the time where we talk about the origins of the universe and the origins of life. And we have biology classes and chemistry classes. And then we're trying to take all of that and figure out, well, then what does Genesis have to say about those things? And so we come up with all these different ways of approaching it. And so some of us in the room are going to look at the first chapter and a little bit of the second chapter and say, well, what this teaches is a literal 6-day creation model. And that's just what it is. And others are going to look and say, well, it's certainly a creation model, but it's an old earth creation model, and that's another theory. And then some people are going to say, no, it's neither one of those. It's actually a gap theory. So you look at verse 1, and then there's a gap between 1 and 2. And so there's a gap theory. And then other people are going to say, no, it's theistic evolution. God used evolution, but he did it over the course of the timeline that science tells us. And then others maybe in this room don't even hold to the name of Jesus. Maybe you're not a Christian. Somebody drug you here, and we're really glad they drug you, right? And you're listening to this going, oh my goodness, here's all these evangelical wingnuts that hate science. It's just evolution. There is no God. There is nothing after death. Like, there's all kinds of views about it. And again, I think those views all exist because we're looking at this text and saying, how do I make it fit with what I know? How do I make these words fit then with whatever, my biology class, my chemistry class, my science background, what I watch on Discovery Channel, right? That's the challenge of it all. And sometimes it's sad because then there are students that go off to college and they feel stuck, right? Where do I land? Do I land with the Bible or do I land with my biology class? Do I land with the Bible? Do I land with what I'm learning in this geology lecture? And it creates all this tension, and people feel like, well, I have to decide between the Bible and science. What do I do? Or I'm trying to make them fit together. What do I do? And so there's a lot of, again, like I said, tension about Genesis chapter 1. What I want to disrupt this morning in some ways is to say, when we go down those roads, not that there isn't value, and not that there shouldn't be discussion, and not that we're not trying to figure out how God did things, but when we do a lot of that, we're kind of short-circuiting what the intent of Genesis 1 is really all about. We're trying to force Genesis 1 to answer our 21st century questions, forgetting that Genesis 1 was written a very long time ago to a group of people who had never heard of Darwin or Einstein, to a group of people that did not see the world in any way like we see it, would not have understood the world that we live in today in any way that would have been cogent for them. They would have looked at our world and just been lost and dumbfounded, and things we take for granted, they would be utterly confused by. So it shouldn't be surprising that sometimes when we step back into their world to read their book, to understand their setting, to know what this message meant for them, that we may at times be a little dumbfounded and confused and bewildered. Because what we're really trying to do this morning is to say, not so much what does it mean to us, but what did it mean to them? See, I think Genesis 1 is a literal telling, but the question is not what does it literally mean to me based on my biases, presuppositions, and scientific background. It's what it mean to them based on their culture, their setting, their conditions, their problems, their lives, and what they were facing. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to jump into the Doc Brown DeLorean and go back, get inside Israelite sandals, and say, all right, how did they hear this for the first time? What did God teach them for the first time? Because it may be a little different than the way we approach it. For example, I'm going to give you a little test right now. This is to yourself. Don't worry, you don't have to raise your hand or anything yet. But if I was to ask you, I want you to work this out in your head. How do you build a home? How do you build a home? Right now, your brain's going to say, I just want you to walk through the steps of how you build a home. Now, in that question, as you're already rifling through steps, some of you are going to say, well, the way you build a home is you buy a piece of property, you get a set of plans, you clear the property, you pour the footings and foundation, you put up the actual, stick work, you frame it out, you do the electrical, you do the plumbing, sheetrock, siding, you put on the roof, you do the finishing work, you've built a home. How many of you said that's how you build a home? All right, you're right. Totally right, it's how you build a home. But you could also say, well, the way you build a home is you create a safe environment and a pleasing environment, and the husband and wife really get along and love one another. And you set the home up in such a way that people want to be there, and it's safe, and it's comfortable, and it's relaxing, and you have open conversations, and you have meals together. That's how you build a home. Now, how many of you thought that is how you build a home? And you're right. So in other words, the question, how you build a home, is pretty straightforward. And both of your answers were literal, but some of you did not think what the other side thought. right? Some of you are like, well, I never thought about the whole idea of a comfortable place and dinner. What do you know, sticks and electricity, man, right? But that's sort of what I'm talking about here. When we look at Genesis 1, we have to look and realize that while we are thinking Western and scientific, how do you build it with stick and wire and concrete? That wasn't their thing. That wasn't their presupposition and disposition. We want to know how it was done. We want to know how. Genesis 1 is not written to the how. It's written to the who did it and why this God did it. It's not sucked into the how. It's not concerned with the how, right? And so this is what we want to begin to get. We want to get rid of our bias and get into their sandals. So what are their sandals? Well, again, like I said, this is a group of refugees coming out of Egypt. They've been in Egypt for hundreds of years, right? That's been their culture. And so they've been immersed in this place where every day, do you know what the Israelites did every day in Egypt? They would go to work and they would build stuff. And primarily they built religious monuments. So every single day they are immersed in being schooled in the religious system of the Egyptian culture. Every day they're putting little Egyptian symbols on walls and monuments, celebrating their gods, celebrating their doctrines, celebrating their belief system, celebrating their values and morals. Every single day this is what they do. They've been doing this for hundreds of years. Dad did it, grandpa did it, great-grandpa did it, everybody does it. We just learn the religion of the Egyptians and we put it on their stuff, and this is the system that we know. Because the other thing you have to remember about this group of Israelites is, guess what they did not have? They didn't have one of these. Genesis has not been written at the time we're reading Genesis. By the end of Genesis, that history, the book of Genesis, still hasn't been written yet. So the Israelites have no Bible. The Israelites have no religious training system put in place. At best, they have some stories passed down. There was this guy named Abraham, and this God came to him named Yahweh, and then he had kids that were stupid, and they had kids that were even more stupid, And then there was this one smart guy that brought us all here, but then eventually people forgot about him, and now we're enslaved. So they don't know a lot of doctrine. They don't have a lot of grounding in who their God is, but they are well schooled in the gods of Egypt. And so every day they've learned this. Every day they've chiseled it onto stone. They know the pantheon of the gods there in the realm that they inhabit. And so they had a lot of dogma. They had a lot of doctrine. They would look at their world probably the same way the Egyptians would look at their world. So they would look at the sun and go, well, that's the sun god. And the moon is the moon god. And the river has a river god, and the fish have a fish god, and the land has a land god, and you get the idea. All these different gods. The average Israelite up in the desert looking at the night sky, staring at the moon, did not think, I wonder how far away it is and what it's made of. Jeez. No, they didn't, they wouldn't do that. They would simply look at the moon and be like, I wonder what it's thinking. I wonder what it demands of me. Same thing with the sun. They wouldn't think about the sun and say, I wonder if it's a burning ball of gas 93 million miles away. They wouldn't do that. They would say, all I need to know about the sun is how to appease the sun so he doesn't burn my crops. I have to appease the gods, whether it's the sun god, moon god, river god, cattle god, earth god, moisture god, rain god, doesn't matter. Better appease them or they will punish me. This is what they think. This is why throughout the history of Israel, what are they always drawn back to? Other gods. This becomes embedded in their DNA. They will forever, until the future exile, at the end of the Old Testament, they will struggle with the idea of our God and a bunch of other gods that are all sort of in contention. And that got built deep into them in Egypt. And so this is what they know. This is what they face. This is their daily life. And that daily life has shaping power. What you believe about your deities, how your deities function, the morals that they advocate, shape your life. They shape your environment. So the question becomes, what was the religious system of the Egyptians then, or the Mesopotamians, or the Babylonians, that whole region? What were the religious system ideas that they held as their values? How did it play out? Well, if I was to give it a modern context, I would say it's a little bit like this. It's a little bit like telenovela meets Mortal Kombat meets Game of Thrones, right? It's pretty much like that. And so when you go back and you look at some of the heritage and history, one of the stories is this female god, Tiamat, who then meets this male god, Apsu. And Tiamat is the sweet waters or the fresh waters, and Apsu is the salty waters. And in the story, they come together, and from their union, their sexual union, they have a number of kids. And you're like, okay, this sounds weird, but okay, whatever. You know what I mean? But one day, the kids wake up mom and dad when they're sleeping. And so dad's so mad, he decides he's going to kill the kids. And so what happens is one of the kids say, forget that, we're killing dad before he kills us. And so he kills dad. And then mom's so upset, she wants vengeance, so she's going to kill the kid that killed dad. So that kid says, wait, well, we need to deal with mom. I'm going to get my kid to kill grandma now. Right? Suddenly it sounds like telenovela, right? Yes, and then the salty man came together with the sweet lady. And, and then they had children they wanted to kill, but then they killed, all this stuff. Right? And so the grandkid then kills grandma, and from her carcass tears her in two, stretches out her hide and makes the earth, and then takes her other portion and makes the heavens. And then from that, he takes all of his brothers and sisters and he sets them up as the various gods, as the sun god, the moon god, the cattle god, the ocean god, the fish god, whatever god that you needed to set up. And so the Egyptians kind of took these ideas, changed some of the names, and so it was Nun and these other, Adam and these different gods, but it was the same idea. And the whole life of the gods, the life cycle of the gods was pretty much sex, violence, human indifference. The only reason the gods created humanity is because they said, you know what? We're sick of working the farm. We need slaves. We'll make the human race to plant crops, grow the cattle, to sacrifice them to us so we don't have to do that work anymore. We want a job where we don't have to work. So we're going to create humanity as a bunch of slaves to serve us. Right? So you have these gods that are perverted, they're aggressive, they're indifferent. There is no relationship between humanity and the gods. It was just a transaction. Right? Dear humans, give us our grain or our food, give us the sacrifices, and we won't kill you. Yay! Right? But that's how simple it was. And so this is the system that they have known for their entire lives, right? And that's why I say, when an Israelite thought about the sun, he thought about a god. He thought about an entity, not a body that was burning gas. He thought about an entity that had a mind that was perverse and violent and indifferent and demanding. That's what he thinks. And therefore, if the gods of your cultural system, the Egyptian gods, have that set of values, what does that do to the values of the culture? It's the same values of the culture. Your gods dictate your morality. So Egyptian culture was perverted, and it was violent, and it was indifferent. This is why the Israelites are enslaved in Egypt, and they're massively just thrown underfoot. Because the gods condone that kind of stuff. Who cares? The world's a cruel place. The gods are cruel gods. That's just the way it works. And so this is the worldview that they know, and that again has formative power. That's going to shape the way you see things in life. It's no different than in a modern context, right? We as Christians, sometimes we're concerned that, if you have a truly humanistic society where God is not in the equation, that things become dehumanizing fast. A good example of that would be the Soviet Union. They said, we don't believe in God. We're an atheist society. And from that, they dehumanize many people. You could look at the Chinese government. We're an atheistic society, and from that, they dehumanize people. Depending on your worldview, it will shape your morality and your ethic. Maybe in a more close-to-home version If a child grows up in a home where it's violent and it's abusive and there's substance abuse, you automatically look at a child coming up in that environment, you go, that's going to have life-forming biases in it. It's going to shape how that child grows up to do life. So in the same way, the Israelites have spent hundreds of years in a system, every day doing the art on it, every day learning it, every day basically advocating it for the Egyptians, and from that it's getting more and more ingrained into them that this is just how the world is. This is how the universe works. But then one day God takes them out of Egypt. One day God removes them from the equation, and it begins to address the error and the abuse of what they have come to know. And as Moses begins to walk through Genesis 1, everything they hear is driven through that lens. It's driven through what they've known, and so they're hearing it in light of that. And what you begin to realize is that Genesis 1 is about combating a creation story. It's not about combating naturalistic theory. It's not about combating evolution. It's about combating actually a creation story that said many gods who were violent and perverted and indifferent and cruel made the universe out of warfare, out of selfishness, out of destruction and chaos. And you're just their little minions to do what they want. That's what they thought, and now suddenly God's going to give them a very different narrative. Not on how he did it, but on who he is and why he did it. See, because the who and the why up to that point were very different for them. But now God rolls into the story. God takes them out of Egypt, and he begins to say to them, in the beginning. Let me correct your thinking. Let me fix your biases. Let me tell you about this amazing thing that happened back in the past. This 7 days that unfolded and the implications of that for your lives. Now, the first thing I want to note about this, in the beginning, it's in the beginning of a cycle, of an event, of this thing that transpired. And I want you to plug into your brain that that event was a 7-day event. It was not a 6-day event. People will say that, well, the 6-day creation model. And I'm saddened by that because I go, it's actually a 7-day model. And maybe what we most forget is that the 7th day, in fact, may be the most important one of all. We get so wrapped up in what does it say about the science, we miss what it says about God and what it says about the 7th day. So it's a 7-day model. It's an inauguration of something. So at the start of this event, it says God created the heavens and the earth. Now, right there, that begins to fix just a singular thing for them. It fixes for them that there's just this one God that's going to be driven home, right? It's not the pantheon of gods that were fighting and squabbling and divided and family feuds and telenovela and everything else. It's not that. No, it's this one God that sets out to establish all things. And as he looks on the scene, it says, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Now, if you're an Israelite out in the desert, coming out of Egypt, and you hear those words, without form, void, darkness, deep waters, all of those words freak you out. They freak you out. Because all of those words for them are chaos words. They're scary. Darkness is scary. Deep waters, they're scary. Void, without form. There's nothing in which to grab onto. So they're hearing all of that, and they're going to instantly associate negative feelings with those ideas. Destructive forces in the cosmic sphere of things. But it's in that context that it says, and then God said. Right? And then God said. Now, here's why this is important. Normally, the way they would understand these stories would be to say, all right, so there was all these negative cosmic powers, darkness and formlessness and deep waters, and they would associate personalities to all of those, like idols, right? They would associate all of that, and then they would expect the rival god to come in, and they would say, but then this god came in and slaughtered. This rival god came in and tore them in two and split their bodies and made the stars from their parts. And it would just be like, wow, Quentin Tarantino is making the universe, Like, that's what they would expect. And instead of it being, and God came in and killed, destroyed, maimed, burned, raped, it says God just said. This God just spoke. His words become life. He doesn't enact violence to create. He doesn't utilize or leverage sex to create, which is many of those Near Eastern stories. Just use everything is having sex to make things. And this God simply speaks and it's created. He decrees and it's transpiring, right? It's words and wisdom that fashion and form the stuff of life. So in Egypt, life in the cosmos comes through violent chaos. But in this story, God looks upon the chaos and he produces life and cosmos. He overturns the chaos with the cosmos. And that word cosmos is interesting. It means to put in order. Matter of fact, the word cosmetic, cosmos, to put in order. It's the same thing. It comes from the same root. Just means to put in order. And so suddenly they're given this story where there's not many gods, but one true God, and he's not engaging in all this craziness the other gods engage in. He just merely calmly, thoughtfully speaks. And he takes anything that's in disorder and he brings order to that system. So again, it has life-formative powers. If you've grown up saying the only way life can happen is through chaos, you're going to embrace chaos. But if you suddenly learn that, no, God is the God that steps into chaos and creates life, that's very different. Especially when you feel like your life's in chaos. We just left Egypt. We're out in the desert. Where's the water? Where's home? My life's in chaos. Oh, wait, this God, he's awesome at taking chaos and bringing cosmos, order, beauty, symmetry, life. It's a message that they need. It's a message that we need. Our lives can be chaotic every day, yet we follow the God that with mere words brings order out of chaos. And so they're hearing this and they're like, wow, this is new. This is revolutionary, right? He has the ability and the authority to make things happen. And then with this, he begins just simply to lay a new foundation. And if you step back at Genesis chapter 1, if you're open to it, you're going to see two sets of 3 days, two triads of 3 days. You're going to have days 1 through 3, and you're going to have days 4 through 6. And they're actually two sets of 3. We would read them as straight through, but I'm going to explain how they're two sets of 3. The first 3 days are what we're going to call forming days, right? So God is forming the environments for things that he will then fill with the next series of days. So on the first day, he forms time, day and night, right? That's what he forms. And then on the second day, he forms the air and the sea. The third day, he forms the ground and the plants. But then you go into the second set of 3. On the fourth day, he takes that space and time that he made that's empty, and then he puts the sun, and he puts the moon, and he puts the stars. And then on the fifth day, he says, I made the air and the sea, so now I'm going to make the birds and the fish. I'm going to fill what I made on day 2. And then on day 6, he says, well, I'm going to take the stuff that I created environmentally on day 3 and fill it with animals and creeping things and human beings. Right? So again, it's a little bit like the first 3 days are him just like creating the room. And the second 3 days is taking stuff and placing it in the room. Right? And as they're hearing this whole thing unfold, they're honestly, they're being blown away by it. right? And as every time he does something, with every iteration, he says, and it was good, it was good, it was good, it was good, it was good. And when humanity comes around, he says, it was very good. They weren't going, oh, it went from bad to good. No, they were listening to that going, wow, every single day that transpires, God brings something new into the equation and it does its function, it does its job, it does its role. It's moving toward a goal. It's like bringing parts together on a machine for this finalizing event. It's moving toward an ultimate kind of thing. And so with this, their minds are blown. It's like, man, God's taking this toward this ultimate goal and big project. Now, part of the reason their minds are blown is because all the way through this, they're learning about the who. One of the who's is God, Yahweh. The God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that they've heard so much about is now beginning to define himself. Right? And he's not impetuous. He's not aggressive. He's not just in it for himself. No, this God is different. He's thoughtful and he's calm and he's precise. He seems in some ways even maybe attractive because he doesn't think chaos is the way forward, but he thinks order is the way forward. But then the other who that they're learning about is they're learning that all of the other who's don't matter. Suddenly they're realizing that what they thought was a deity, the Son, is just something that this one God just created. Wasn't a rival, wasn't a part of the pantheon of gods. It's an object. And this is going to be a hard thing for them to detach from. Like, no, all we've known our whole life is who's the Son and what does he want? And now it's this one guy says, nah, man, I put it in the sky to give you daytime. What about the moon god? Night. What about the stars? More lights, right? Well, what about the cattle? What about the plants? And what about the earth? The earth is a god, right? No, the earth is something I made. It was formless and void, and I brought order out of chaos, and I've given it to you. In fact, here's the thing. You don't serve the creation. I made it all to put you in it. You don't labor for it as though it rules over you. I've made you for something different. See, that's what I mean by this whole story is revolutionary for them. All of these things they thought were deities are now simply gifts. The sun is a gift, it's not a god. The sea is a gift, so stop being afraid of it, go fishing. Right? It's a totally different way of them seeing life. Because up to this point, they thought they were just born in an environment of collateral damage. Gods were at war, creation was made, they served the gods, end of story. Instead, we see that, this thoughtful, caring, life-giving God said, I did it by my own word and for my life with you. Right? That's why he did it. He made the world to be inhabited. He didn't make the world in the aftermath of a violent eruption. He made it to be inhabited. In fact, in the book of Isaiah, chapter 45, it says, "For thus says the Lord who created the heavens, he is God who formed the earth, he made it, he established it. He did not create it empty. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is no other." Again, I'm taking it back to what the Israelites would have thought. They would have thought we're just an accident. Sounds like science sometimes, right? That's what they would have. I'm just an accident. I wasn't intended. I was an accident. Gods were fighting. Things were made. From that, they needed slaves ultimately, but it really wasn't intentional or on purpose. But God says, no. I actually formed the entire thing. I made the whole thing to put you in it. That's a very different narrative. I love it in Proverbs chapter 8. Here's another one. Wisdom is personified in Proverbs chapter 8. It says, when he established the heavens, I was there. Wisdom was there. When he drew the circle on the face of the deep, when he made when he made firm the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limits so that the waters may not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, when I was beside him like a master workman, I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world and delighting in the children of man. No one up to the time of the writing of the text that we have before us, would have seen a God delighting in creation, making it to be inhabited, having this sense of love affair with it. Genesis 1 has this sense of care, investment, involvement, just pouring in. That, again, for them, they're like, what are you talking about? We've never heard of this kind of God before. Really, he has that kind of interest in us? And the answer is, yeah. It's why he made humanity, to be with them. And it's why he made everything else, to put humanity in it, to be with them. Now, next week, we'll get more into the made in God's image. We'll look at the humanity side. But today, I want to make sure that we get that it's not simply about the 6 days. Because sometimes when I hear things out of Genesis, the first chapter, I'll hear people say, and then on the end of day 6, God made humanity the pinnacle of creation. I'm like, no, there's another day. Day 6 is not the end. Day 6 is not the pinnacle, right? There's another thing. There is this day 7. In fact, if anything, what I want you to know is that this is a 7-day story. Now, for us, that may not mean a lot. Right, we go, okay, fine, whatever, 6 days, 7 days. He stopped making on day 6. He did something else on day 7. Cool. But again, I want to try to get us in the sandal of the Israelites. You remember what they did all the time, every day, for hundreds of years. What did they do? Built temples. They built temples, and they built religious monuments, and built all this stuff, right? And so they're used to things that happen with temples. Also keep in mind that as Moses is sharing the book of Genesis with the Israelites, they're preparing to build something themselves. For the first time, they'll be building something to the one true God, not a temple to other crazy gods that are just impetuous and wild, but to the one true God. It's called the tabernacle. It's going to be this big tent. They're going to put the Ark of God's covenant with the 10 Commandments inside. They're in the middle of it and everything else. They're going to build this tabernacle, this thing where God connects with his people. So similar but different from the temples they used to build back in Egypt, where their gods would come and interact with the people, or where they even thought some of their people were gods, such as the Pharaoh. Something similar but different, but still this thing where God connects with people. Later, they're going to build a temple under Solomon. And it's going to be this place where God comes and is with his people. Now, here's the similarity between all those things. It may take years to build a temple, but once it was built, there was a process, an inauguration of how long? 7 days, right? Whether it was Egyptian or whether it was Israelite, there's a 7-day model. So again, you may take a long time to build the object, but when it was time for the deity or for Yahweh to come to be among his people, there was a 7-day process. And over that 7 days, there was this consecration that would go on, where you would bring this new thing into the temple and consecrate it and see it kind of set apart and made holy. And you do that for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, what happens? God comes to that place and he rests in that place among his people. So at the tabernacle, after 7 days, God comes and rests over the ark. When they do the temple under Solomon on the 7th day, God comes and rests in the space of the temple. So what happens on the 7th day here in Genesis? It says in chapter 2, it says, thus the heavens and the earth were finished and all of the hosts in them. And on the 7th day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all of his work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and made it holy because on it God rested from all of his work that he had done. Now, obviously, we know better than to think God was exhausted. Man, I mean, you're working 24-hour shifts for 6 days. You need a nap after that. Now, none of us think that. Nobody should read chapter 2 and say God was beat. But if you read this as the Israelites are hearing it, they're hearing this as God made the cosmos not just simply to be inhabited, he made the cosmos as his own temple. He inaugurated it over this 7-day period. He set in place everything and said it was good, it was good, it was good, it was good, it was very good. And then he comes and he rests in this space, right? This is a much bigger vision than they could have ever understood. Because suddenly, God is so personal, so involved. It's not just a space over here or a space over there. It was God intended the whole thing to be a space. Sometimes when I talk with friends, as we're talking science and we're talking God, and they'll say, well, if God made it all, why is there so much empty space? Right? You look at the universe and most of it is empty. Why is there so much empty space? And my thing is, have you ever been to a palace? They're relatively empty. I mean, there's stuff on the walls and but there's a lot of open space to show what? The grandness. Right? So in the same way, God makes this grand palace, this grand temple that is the cosmos. But then in that, he comes and he wants to dwell among. This is what they needed to understand about how things originally were. Now, of course, by Genesis 3, things get broken. We're not there yet. But he's saying, this is how it was originally designed, that I would dwell with you. In fact, listen to Psalm 137. This is great. It says, let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, and go to your resting place. You and where the ark of your might would be. For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it to be his dwelling place. For this is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it. You see in a small way how the temple is sort of this microcosm of what the original design was. This idea of resting among, resting in, resting with. And so these refugees who have no real functional understanding of their God need to understand how God originally did things. Need to understand the original tensions, the original tone, the original character, the original heart, the original wisdom in play. They need to understand that his intent is always to dwell with his people because he loves them and he cares for them and he is their God. That again answers their who and their why. Again, God is not concerned with the how in this. They're not asking that question. The Israelites are not asking the question of what are stars outside of are they deities or not. They don't care about their composition. They don't care how far away they are. They don't care about how fast light travels. They just don't care. They don't look up at the mountains and go, all those different stratas, I wonder how they were created. It's not their thing. In fact, I would give the illustration. It's like a child coming to a mom and a dad and saying, where do babies come from? Right? And if you say, well, there's this sperm and an egg and then a zygote, and they're like, oh. You say, from mommy's tummy. Oh, okay. It's a different question for the Israelites than it is for us. And so that's what I'm trying to say. We need to not force Genesis 1 to answer our scientific quandary. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't engage in the conversations. It doesn't mean that it isn't important to investigate. And certainly, I'm not advocating that we say, you know what, remove God from the scientific equation. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, let's not make one page of the Bible answer all of those questions. I would love it if every science textbook was one page. That would make science so easy. But again, it's not the mission of this text. In fact, I read some quotes this week that I thought were so good. One is from Conrad Heyer. And he says this about Genesis 1. He says, what Genesis 1 is undertaking and accomplishing is a radical and sweeping affirmation of monotheism, the idea that there is one God, over and against the idea of many gods, syncretism, and idolatry. Each day of creation dismisses an additional cluster of deities. On the first day, the gods of light and darkness are dismissed. On the second day, the gods of sky and sea. On the third day, the earth gods and the gods of vegetation. On the fourth day, the sun, moon, and star gods. The fifth and sixth days take away any associations with divinity from the animal kingdom. And finally, human hierarchical ideas such as Pharaoh is a god is emptied of any intrinsic divinity as God speaks each day. This is how the Israelites are hearing it. Kind of building on this, there was a quote from J.I. Packer that I thought was so good. He says, Genesis 1 and 2 tell us who, without giving many answers about how. Some today may think that this is a defect, But in the long perspective of history, our present day scientific preoccupation with how rather than who looks somewhat odd in and of itself. Rather than criticize these chapters for not feeding our secular interest, we should take them for what we need and the rebuke that they give, our perverse passion for knowing nature without regard for what matters most, namely knowing nature's creator. The message of these two chapters is this: have you seen the sea? Have you seen the sky, the sun, the moon, the stars? Have you watched the birds and the fish? Have you observed the landscape, the vegetation, the animals, the insects, all the big and little things together? Have you marveled at the wonderful complexity of human beings with all of their power and skill and the deep feelings of fascination, attraction, and affection that men and women arouse in one another? Fantastic, isn't it? Now, why don't you try meeting the one who is behind it all? It is as if to say, now that you've enjoyed the work of art, now you can shake hands with the artist. Since you are thrilled by the music, we will introduce you to the composer. It was to show us the creator rather than the creation, and to teach us knowledge of God rather than the physical sciences. See, that's what this is really all about. Chapter 1, going into chapter 2, it's exposing us to the character of God, the who made it. The personal, benevolent God who with mere words, not warfare, shapes chaos into cosmos. And he did it to make a world inhabited so that he would then inhabit that world with those who inhabit it. It was about our relationship to him. That is the why that he did it. How? We're learning that. We're still learning the how. And every year, science corrects its how. That's how authoritative it is. Every passing year we learn something new and we discard something old, and we're probably going to be doing that for a very long time until we get there and we go, oh, that's how you did it. But until then, what we can focus on is the who and the why. And what is great about this is that the same God who originally established so that we might dwell with him and he with us is the same God in which, after it was broken, engaged in the same act of coming in again, right? Coming back into the temple that he built as a different kind of temple. Coming back into the world that was broken and dwelling among us and with us so that we might then again dwell with him. I want to close by turning your attention to Colossians chapter 1. This is what we learned last week, and I want to continue what it says. Paul, our friend, is praying for this group of people in this church, and he says, so from the day we heard, have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God. He says, may you be strengthened with all power according to his glorious might for all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance in the saints in the light. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. Hopefully you memorized it this week and you've prayed it every day, all right? But then he continues. It is this Jesus. He is the image of the invisible God. He is the firstborn, the head, literally, over all creation. The same God in Genesis 1 is right here. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. He made it to be inhabited and to inhabit it with us. But then we fell, rebelled, sinned. We broke the relationship. Yet he is still before all things. And in him all things hold together. That is why he is the head of the body of the church. He is the beginning. He is the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. The same God that made the universe that said, I wanted to relate to you, is the same God that came back into our creation and said, I so want to relate to you, I will give myself for you. I'll come back into the temple that you've desecrated, and I will be the temple that is again desecrated so that I might reclaim you to myself, and therefore we might dwell together forever. That is the God of Genesis 1 that we need to know. That is the God of Genesis 2 that we need to know. That is the Jesus of Genesis that we need to know. Let's pray together. Jesus, I thank you for your grace and goodness. I thank you for the fact that we can look at your word in perhaps a new light, which isn't really new, it's an old way. It's looking through the eyes of the original hearer that only knew a life of chaos, only knew a life of broken dreams and broken identities and broken deities, that only knew violence, sex, indifference, dehumanization. And then you pierced in, and you said, let there be light in more than one way. I pray that that is what we realize, and as we continue through Genesis and the narrative begins to shift a little bit from the heaviness of the first day of understanding how we read this, but maybe in that shift begin to see a personal God that's working throughout to reclaim that which is broken. I pray that we will realize that you do that with our lives as well. And so I thank you for what you teach us and show us, and I thank you for how much you love us and desire to dwell with us. It's in your name we pray these